This camera has two key information displays. Now the first one is a traditional information display on the top of the camera here. It's an LCD display, nothing too fancy, but don't underestimate the power of this key data at your fingertips. This displays the really useful stuff like your color temperature setting, where your metering's sitting at, your ISO, your shutter speed, your aperture, and in stills mode, how many stills you have available on that particular card, as well as your shutter release mode and other key data, including your battery info. Now that's your kind of standard information you'd expect when taking stills. But when you're in movie mode, there are things that you need at a different position because you're not sitting looking down on the camera, you're looking at the back of the camera. And so there's a great function on here called Q, and that's your quick menu. So when you first press Q, the very top icon is Auto Lighting Optimizer. You might ask, what is Auto Lighting Optimizer? It's a very good question. It's a function that will not work in manual mode, and therefore, as far as we're concerned in movie mode, we don't need to know about it. Next down is your media. It's telling you which card you're recording to. Scroll down again and it gives you your frame rate and your codec. Next down to that is your manual audio control. Now, when you're not in record mode, you have to use the quick control dial to manually control and set your audio. But when you go into record mode, you can manually control the audio using the touch sensitive panel on the quick control dial. That means that you can silently adjust your audio level while you're recording. This is a really useful function if you want to adjust your settings quietly whilst filming. When you put the camera into record mode, all that information disappears. Then you put the Q menu up, you can actually adjust what to alter in the frame silently. So I can adjust my shutter speed here. Now I know I said we should always shoot at 1/50th and I still stick to that, but here it's completely silent. If I want to change my aperture, now obviously you'll still hear the motors going in the lens to change the iris leaves, but you could close down and open up to get a better exposure, or perhaps change your ISO. So while these are slightly crude controls, they are controls nonetheless, and they are almost silent. The ISO goes up in third of a stop increments, and so you can have quite a lot of subtle control. It really is a hidden gem in this camera, the ability to silently control those key functions. Now, they're not going to be ideal in every scenario, but when you need that little bit of control, when you've got no choice, you've started recording and the person in front of the camera has to keep going, at least you're not left with some footage that you can't then use later on. The viewer at home may not necessarily notice the difference, but you may notice the difference, and it's all about getting the pictures to work when you absolutely have no other choice. And finally, there's one more display button which is worth looking at, and it's this button here, the info display. Now this has 4 different levels, and I want to scroll through now and show you what those levels offer you up in terms of additional information when you're filming. So the info display comes in 4 levels. Level 1 is the time and your basic exposure information. We've got a 50th of a second shutter there, f6.3, and our meter is looking pretty spot on right in the middle there. We've got our shutter count on the number of images we can take before we run out of memory, and our ISO setting and battery indicator. That's our basic menu. The second level is somewhat more involved and it shows up a lot of information. Now it's up to you how much information you want to show here, but as a quick reference it's very useful. The third menu brings up your histogram. This is very, very useful when exposing. And finally, you can have everything off. You have got some options to control how much information shows up in the info display. If you go to the yellow spanner menu, submenu 3, there is the info button display options. You can display camera settings, you can display the electronic level, and you can display shooting functions. But you can only control those three. So have a play around, see what you're comfortable with. How much information you have on your info display is entirely subjective. So it's up to you to work out how much information you're comfortable with and how much you just find a little distracting. I personally prefer a very minimal display. I like to have access to my histogram because then I can check my exposure.